to show you two methods for cutting the 2+2 blocks that Marti calls for in her pattern. The 2+2 blocks are flying geese blocks. And on page 10 of her pattern, she shows us how to use template A, number 2, to cut the 2+2 blocks. The template is the same width as the number 1, so you'll go ahead and use the number 1 square to determine the width of the strip. And you'll need to cut, two strips that width. The first method that I'm going to show you for cutting the 2+2 blocks is a method that Marti demonstrates on page 10. You'll note that if you take your half square triangle you can make your first cut and slide that section away. You will then take your triangle and flip it matching that notched engineer corner here and the notched engineer corner at the top. To make your second cut. Pull that unit aside and you can notch off these corners later. For your next cut, you'll flip it once again. Again, you'll use your notched engineer corner here and your engineer corner here. Set that aside. And you can see that you can get 2 of those flying geese units from that strip. We'll set these aside and we'll use the number 2 template to go ahead and engineer these corners. And now we have our 8 background pieces. It doesn't matter which method we use, they come out to being the right size. Marti's cutting instructions ask you for the background fabric to cut 4 using template set C number 15, which is the square that is on point. It's a 4 3/4 inch square, but you're cutting it the width of the fabric on point. You'll see the lengthwise grain of fabric here. Now if you don't happen to have set C, you just need 4 of these blocks, and so it is possible, if you're very careful with your piecing, to cut 4 3/4 inch squares, engineer your corners, and use those instead of using the on point set from set C. Of course, the on point set is going to make sure that your block is the exact shape, and it is cut with the correct grain of fabric. To cut my fabric number B, I have a fat 1/8 of fabric, which is 9 inches wide, 18 inches long. I fold it in half, and I'll begin by removing the selvage. Again, I'm cutting from the lengthwise grain of fabric. Remove that selvage and set it aside. Marti's pattern on page 8 calls for us to cut 4 number 1 squares. Again, I'll use the square to determine the width of my strip, and I just need one strip. I'll cut the 4 squares that I need from that one strip and engineer the corners. We also need to cut 8 number 2 triangles, the half squares. Again, that number 1 square is the same width, so we'll use it to determine the width of the strip. And we'll just need to cut one of those. Again, those strips are doubled, so I'm actually getting 2 strips out of that in order to get my 8 number 2 units. We'll set that fabric aside. To cut those number 2 half square units, you simply line up your template on your fabric and then flip it over for your second cut. Flip it over for your third cut. And one final flip for your fourth cut. Then you can stack these triangle sets on top of each other and engineer your corners. When cutting fabric C, our design is going to differ a little bit from Marti's pattern because the center star unit that we have in our design is a different color than these outer Carpenter's Wheel units. So we only need to have 8 number 2 half squares cut for that center star. Again, you'll use the number 1 square to determine the width of your strip. The fabric is doubled. So you will make 1 cut and then cut your 8 half square units using the same flipping method that you used previously with fabric B. To cut the outer Carpenter's Wheel fabric C, begin by folding your fabric over. We have a fat quarter here. We have it folded over with the selvage to the raw edge, and trim that selvage off. We'll be cutting from the lengthwise grain of fabric. We need to have 16 number 2 triangles. Again, you'll use the number 1 square to determine the width of your strip. And you'll cut 1 strip. You'll use your number 2 half square, flipping as you go, as we just learned how to do, and you'll make 16 of those units. To make the cut for the parallelograms for fabric C, we'll be cutting those also from our dark red fabric. You're going to be using a method that Marti describes on pages 11 and 12 of her pattern. It's another 2 plus 2 method, and she actually gives us 2 ways to do it. Using the 3.5 inch width of a strip or 2 5/8 inch width of a strip. Both will result in the same parallelogram, but I found that using the 3.5 inch strip was easier, so that's the method I'm going to demonstrate. We need to have 4 of the parallelograms. We'll be using our number 1 square which is our 3.5-inch square, 3-inch finished. Use that to determine the width of the strip to cut, and cut one strip. Remember, our fabric is doubled over, so we actually have 2 pieces of fabric cut. Set the rest aside. It's important when cutting your parallelograms to make sure that all of your fabrics are facing the same direction so that your parallelograms will all face the direction that they are intended to do. If you double your fabric over with your right sides together, you'll end up with 2 parallelograms that go the wrong direction. Turn the fabric on its side to begin your cuts. Your first cut will simply be to get a good starting point. So there's our starting point for our parallelogram. Now we need to take our template and line up that notched engineered corner here on our diagonal and our engineered corner here, and make our second cut. Once we've done that, our parallelogram piece is cut. We'll do the same for our next parallelogram. We'll do the same for our next parallelogram. Again, matching this engineered corner with our diagonal line. Here, and the other engineered corner matching up with the edge of our fabric. Once we have our 2 parallelograms cut, lay them on top of each other and use your template to engineer your corners.